As a forward-looking and future-focused people, we can't help but be just a little bit curious about what awaits us in the so-called end times. For a while there, it seemed like you couldn't go more than a few months without seeing a new doomsday or apocalyptic movie or TV show or book series that was being released. A few years back, there was a stretch of a few months where I regularly got emails with detailed timelines predicting World War III and the rapture and, when to expect the end to arrive as a result. Thankfully, those emails stopped, and either they figured out that they were wrong and went on to go do more productive things with their times, or more likely it was just that Google improved their spam filtering capabilities. The problem with people's obsession with predicting the end of the world is that they're really bad at it. We are for however many hundreds of thousands of predictions have been made so far, with not a single one that has been right. So far, at least. I remember a few years back seeing a t-shirt that had a bunch of different dates written on it, and each one had a big line striking it out, and the caption at the bottom said, "I survived yet another apocalypse." And it got me thinking. So I looked up a few of those failed predictions to refresh my memory. Anyone remember the great Maya apocalypse, set to take place on December 21st, which is my birthday, in 2012? It was believed that the end of the Maya calendar would herald the end of the world. Not so much. Or what about May 21st, 2011? A man named Harold Camping calculated that date as being exactly 7,000 years to the day after the Great Flood, which coincidentally is our adult ed topic for this afternoon, so please come back for our class to learn more about it. This was the most famous of his 12 different end-of-the-world predictions that were all based on his interpretation of biblical numerology. But when May 21st came and went without incident, he pushed it back to October 21st, which incidentally is my dad's birthday. I'm not sure how I feel about all these doomsday predictions being so closely connected to birthdays in my family, but thankfully nothing happened on that day either. Probably my favorite story that I found when I was doing research was about the so-called prophet hen of Leeds. In 1806, a domesticated hen in Leeds, England, appeared to be laying eggs inscribed with the words, "Christ is coming," and it created quite the stir. It turned out, however, that it was actually the hen's owner who was the one writing those words on the eggs and reinserting them into the hen, which is a pretty anticlimactic end to a very promising storyline. So, it's passages like the one that I just read that are partly to blame with this obsession. This desire to predict when, where, and how Jesus is going to come back, what Judgment Day is going to look like, and precisely how the world that we know and love is going to end. Our gospel story for today is affectionately referred to in the scholarly world as Mark's little apocalypse. Jesus and his disciples are in Jerusalem, and it's a few days before that fateful Passover evening, when he will be betrayed by one of his own. And stories like this that make me feel great compassion and sympathy for the disciples. They're walking out of the temple where Jesus has just loudly and publicly criticized the systems of exploitation that prey on the poorest and most vulnerable in their society. And so, to lighten the mood, one of the disciples says, "Wow, that's a big building." Maybe he was hoping to take a break from provoking the wrath of the empire and the religious establishment, and I don't know, take a little walking architectural tour through the holy city. After all, historical accounts of the temple in Jerusalem do indeed attest to its massive size and grand appearance. About 20 years before Jesus was born, the temple was reconstructed at the behest of King Herod the Great, which was just about 500 years after the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. This new temple was said to have been twice as large as the Roman Forum and nearly 4 times as large as the Athenian Acropolis. The front of the temple was adorned with so much silver and gold that the ancient historian Josephus reported that when the sun was shining at the right angle, the reflection was so bright that it nearly blinded anyone who looked at it. So this disciple's offhand comment about its splendor seems more than warranted. And yet, Jesus responds by saying, "You think this is impressive? Well, let me tell you, not a stone will remain on stone." This particular section of the passage specifically predicts the destruction of the temple, which would happen just a few decades later in the year 70 CE at the hands of the Romans. But as the passage continues, Jesus goes on to make more general statements about the apocalyptic woes that await our world. And understandably, the disciples want to know specifics. When, where, and how all these things are going to come to pass. And while Jesus gives them some signs and portents to be on the lookout for, he doesn't give them a specific timeline. He makes it clear, both here as well as in other passages, that it is not for us to know exactly when all of this will happen. It seems that once again we're asking the wrong questions. Instead of wondering about when and how, Jesus is inviting us to ask ourselves, where and in what do we place our trust? Is it in the institutions and the edifices of this world? In human systems and the things that we as people have built? Or do we place our trust in the sure and certain foundation that is our God? I'm reminded of the words of that old hymn, "On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand." Institutions will fail us. The systems that we have created will fail us. The things that humanity has built will crumble with time. The one constant, the one thing that will not fail us is our steadfast and loving Creator. The love of Christ will never fail us. The abiding spirit of the abiding presence of the Holy Spirit will not abandon us. And so the question then becomes, how do we remain centered and grounded in God no matter what this world throws our way? Because unfortunately, we don't have to look far off into the distant future to find things that resemble these signs that Jesus is talking about. Just as Jesus warned, there are people today who would boldly declare, "I am He," and would have us believe that they can provide us with deliverance and salvation. The news is full of stories of war and rumors of war, from Ukraine to Israel and Palestine to the Sudanese civil war and many more. Famines that are currently happening in South Sudan, Burkina Faso, Mali, and not to mention the fact that 47 million people, or 1 in 7 households in the United States, qualify as food insecure. And nation has indeed risen against nation. However you might feel about the recent election, it cannot be denied that we live in a deeply divided country, one that seems to prioritize us versus them ways of thinking, where might makes right, and where many fear for their livelihood and for their own personal safety, as well as the safety of their families. And here we move from a global scale to a more personal one, because each and every one of us has experienced something that made it feel like our whole world was ending. Perhaps it was an unexpected diagnosis or a sudden loss, a relationship that you thought would always be there that suddenly ends, or finding out that the person who always was your rock wasn't actually the person you thought they were. What do we do when it feels like our whole world is collapsing around us and everyone else is just going about their lives, oblivious to the ruins that we are living in? I guess the good news, if you can call it that, is that this has been the case practically since Jesus ascended into heaven. War, strife, political discord, corruption, and calamity are not things that we presently have a monopoly on, but rather have been hallmarks throughout all of human history. But unfortunately, at least for me, the answer that it's always been that way does little to ease my distress. Regardless of the prevalence of such things throughout history, it does not take away from the fact that right now, life and the state of the world can feel rather bleak. Whether we're speaking politically or environmentally or interpersonally, hope can seem so absent and faint, and we can feel so powerless to make even a dent in the fear, anger, meanness, and division that seems so prevalent these days. So what are we to do? Well, when faced with these realities, one thing that we can do is turn to the wisdom, grace, and insight of those truth tellers and merchants of hope that God has blessed us with throughout the ages. There's a quote that I love from the first book of the Lord of the Rings trilogy by J.R.R. Tolkien. I figured that since I preached on Harry Potter a few weeks ago, I should toss in some Lord of the Rings stuff this week. After all, my nickname growing up was Samwise, and that is how the majority of the people in my hometown have me saved in their phones, and it's also the name on the back of my softball jersey. So, in the book, Frodo is talking to Gandalf, and he has just learned the truth about the ring that he inherited from his uncle Bilbo. And he says, "I wish it need not have happened in my time." To which Gandalf replies, "So do I. And so do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us." I included this quote in my annual report for 2021 as we reflected on the pandemic. I think it highlights two really important things. The first is that it is important for us to acknowledge our own feelings and where our hearts are at. Gandalf doesn't dismiss Frodo's grief and fear. He honors it. He holds space for what Frodo is feeling, and he highlights the universality of feeling that way in the face of such a daunting task. That being said, while he does not dismiss it, neither does he linger there for too long, before reminding Frodo that while we may not have control over what happens to us, we do have control over how we respond to those things. We have the choice to choose hope in the face of despair, to choose love in the face of hate, to choose mercy in the face of cruelty, to choose to follow the teachings of Jesus and stand on that firm foundation that we have in God, no matter what this world throws at us. Martin Luther once famously said that if he knew that the world was ending tomorrow, he would still plant a tree today. Because in the face of the unknown, the uncertain, the scary and overwhelming, in the face of the things that seem far too big and beyond our control, one small act of kindness and hope can make all the difference. In addition to Tolkien and Luther, there is a quote from the Talmud that has been a source of great comfort and strength for me. The Talmud is a collection of teachings on the Jewish scriptures, and in the section that discusses a verse from the book of Micah 6:8 to be precise, it says, "Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it." You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. This statement is both freeing and convicting. It releases us from the overwhelming enormity of trying to fix the world around us completely and all by ourselves, but it does not set us free from all responsibility. It charges us with doing what we can while we can, and only then leaving the rest to God and to others. It is simultaneously a call to action while also being a release from ultimate responsibility, because ultimate responsibility always lies with and in God's hands. And the best part about all of this is that we don't have to do these things alone. God has blessed us with the gift of community. We should take to heart the words that we heard from the book of Hebrews in our first reading for today. Let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who has promised is faithful. And let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day of the Lord approaching. Let us provoke one another to love and good deeds. Let us pick up the banner for others when they flag or fail, because as we all know, it can be truly exhausting, repeatedly running into the brick wall that is this world's troubles. And yet, Jesus promises that no matter how firm that wall might feel, not a stone will remain on stone. The seemingly immovable edifices of this world, the fear, anxiety, violence, loss that seems so untamable, all of those things will crumble away, and the sure and steady foundation of God's love will be all that remains. And until that day, we have the choice of what to do with the time that we have been given. So let us do justice. Let us love mercy. Let us walk humbly. For while we are not called to finish the work, neither are we free to abandon it. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs, and God is working to make all things new. Amen.